The war in the Pacific was over. Not in August, not after 2 atomic bombs leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was over in July. At least, it could have been. In the summer of 1945, Japan's emperor personally authorized secret peace negotiations. His envoys were already in Moscow. His conditions were already on the table. And in Washington, inside a locked room at the War Department, American intelligence analysts were reading every word. They called it magic. And what magic revealed, what Truman read, what his cabinet discussed, and what was then quietly set aside, remained buried in classified archives for decades. This is not a story about whether the atomic bomb was necessary. That debate has been running for 80 years, and it will keep running. This is a story about what was known, when it was known, and what was decided anyway. The documents exist, they have been declassified, and they tell a story that the official history of World War II has never fully absorbed. 1. The machine that read Japan's mail. To understand what Truman knew in July 1945, you first have to understand what American intelligence could do by that point in the war. By 1945, the United States had been reading Japanese diplomatic communications for years. The operation had a name: Magic. It began in 1940, when a team of Army cryptanalysts cracked the Japanese diplomatic cipher, a machine the Americans called Purple. The Japanese Foreign Ministry used Purple to communicate with its embassies around the world. And from the moment American analysts broke the code, Washington was effectively sitting in on those conversations. Every cable sent from Tokyo to its ambassador in Moscow, every instruction from the Foreign Ministry to its negotiators in Stockholm, in Bern, in Lisbon, every reply that came back. By the summer of 1945, the magic summaries, daily intelligence digests compiled from intercepted traffic, were landing on the desks of a very short list of people: the President, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of State, the Joint Chiefs. Harry Truman had been receiving them since the day he took office in April 1945, 3 months after Roosevelt's death. He was reading Japan's most secret communications in near real time. And in the summer of 1945, those communications were carrying an unmistakable message. Japan was looking for a way out. 2. The Emperor moves. To understand what Japan was trying to do in the summer of 1945, you have to understand the position the Emperor was in, and what it meant for him to act at all. Hirohito was not, in the Western imagination, a powerful figure. He was a symbol, remote, semi-divine, surrounded by protocol so rigid that most of his own government never spoke to him directly. But in the summer of 1945, Hirohito broke with tradition in a way that was, within the context of Japanese politics, almost without precedent. He intervened. By June 1945, the military situation was catastrophic. The battle for Okinawa had ended with over 100,000 Japanese soldiers dead and civilian casualties in the tens of thousands. American B-29s were firebombing Japanese cities methodically, night after night. Tokyo had been largely destroyed. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. The Japanese Navy was gone. The Air Force was reduced to kamikaze attacks. American submarines had cut off the supply lines that Japan needed to function as an industrial economy. The war was lost. Everyone in the Japanese government who was capable of rational analysis knew it. The question was not whether Japan would lose. The question was what losing would look like. And on that question, the Japanese government was paralyzed. The military leadership, the army above all, was committed to a concept called Ketsugo, the decisive battle on the Japanese home islands. The idea was that an American invasion would be so costly in American lives
that Washington would negotiate rather than continue. The army was preparing to arm civilians with bamboo spears. It was not a plan, it was a fantasy. But it was the fantasy the army was committed to dying for and killing for. Against this, a faction around the emperor was pushing for negotiation. Not surrender, negotiation. There was a difference, and it mattered enormously. The word surrender in the Japanese political context of 1945 carried implications that went beyond the military. It raised the question of what would happen to the emperor, to the imperial institution, to the entire framework of Japanese society that was organized around the figure of a divine sovereign. This was the sticking point. This was, in the end, almost the only sticking point. Japan's peace faction was willing to accept defeat. It was willing to accept occupation. It was willing to accept punishment for the war. What it could not accept, what it needed as a condition for any agreement, was a guarantee that the emperor would not be tried as a war criminal, that the imperial institution would survive. In June 1945, Hirohito authorized his government to approach the Soviet Union, still technically neutral in the Pacific War, as an intermediary. He chose his former prime minister, Prince Fumimaro Konoye, as his personal envoy, and he approved a message that was to be conveyed to Moscow. Japan wished to end the war. Japan was prepared to negotiate. Japan needed to know that the imperial institution would be preserved. The cables carrying this message went out through the Foreign Ministry's purple cipher. Magic picked them up within hours. Washington was reading them before Moscow had formally responded.
3. What the cables said. The magic intercepts from June and July 1945 are now declassified. They sit in the National Archives. Historians have been working through them for decades. What they show is a picture of a Japanese government that was divided, desperate, and actively searching for an exit from a war it knew it had lost. On July 12, 1945, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo sent a cable to Ambassador Naotake Sato in Moscow. The cable instructed Sato to request a meeting with Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. The purpose of the meeting was to inform the Soviets that Japan wished to send Prince Konoye to Moscow as a special envoy, carrying a personal message from the emperor. The message, as Togo described it in the cable, was that Japan desired to restore peace with all possible speed. Those were the words. Not explore options, not discuss terms. Restore peace with all possible speed. Sato received the instruction and immediately requested the meeting with Molotov. Molotov was unavailable. He was preparing to leave for Potsdam, where the Allied leaders were scheduled to meet in 2 weeks. The meeting was postponed. But the cable existed. Washington had it. Truman's intelligence briefers summarized it, and on July 13th, the day after Togo sent it, the summary landed on the desks of the people who needed to read it. 3 days later, on July 16th, the first atomic bomb was successfully tested in the New Mexico desert. Truman received word of the test at Potsdam, where he had just arrived for the conference. Secretary of War Henry Stimson handed him the message in person. The test had worked. The device had produced an explosion equivalent to approximately 20,000 tons of TNT. The United States now had a weapon unlike anything that had existed before. And in Washington, the magic summaries kept coming. On July 17th, the day after the Trinity test, the day Truman learned the bomb worked, another intercept arrived. Ambassador Sato in Moscow, responding to Togo's instructions, sent back a cable that was strikingly blunt. Sato was a realist. He had been watching the military situation deteriorate for months, and in his reply to Togo, he said something that his superiors in Tokyo did not want to hear. Japan needed to surrender. Not negotiate. Surrender. Unconditionally, if necessary. The alternative was annihilation. Togo's response came back quickly. The foreign minister acknowledged Sato's assessment, but he explained that there was one condition, one point on which there could be no flexibility. The imperial house must be preserved. That was it. That was the condition. Not territory, not reparations, not the fate of military commanders, the emperor. Washington read this exchange as it happened. 4. Potsdam. The Potsdam Conference opened on July 17, 1945. Truman was there. Churchill was there, though he would be replaced mid-conference by Clement Attlee after losing the British general election. Stalin was there. The official agenda was the post-war settlement in Europe, Germany, borders, reparations, the occupation zones that were already hardening into something that looked uncomfortably permanent. But Japan was present in every conversation, even when it wasn't the subject. Truman knew about the magic intercepts. He knew about Togo's cables to Sato. He knew about the Konoye mission. He knew that Japan was trying to use Moscow as an intermediary to open peace negotiations. He also knew, as of July 16th, that the atomic bomb worked. And he knew something else, something that had been driving American strategic planning for months. The military's estimate for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, was catastrophic. Army planners projected American casualties in the hundreds of thousands. Some estimates ran higher. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, were projected to be in the millions. The bomb offered an alternative, a way to force Japanese surrender without an invasion, without those casualties. But the bomb raised a question that Potsdam had to answer. What exactly were the terms being offered to Japan? On July 26th, the United States, Britain and China issued what became known as the Potsdam Declaration. It was an ultimatum. Japan must surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. The declaration said nothing about the emperor. This was not an oversight. Within the American government, there had been a serious debate about whether to include a clause guaranteeing the imperial institution. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had argued for it. He understood, because he had read the magic intercepts, that the emperor question was the central obstacle to Japanese surrender. Include a guarantee, Stimson argued, and Japan might surrender without the bomb, without an invasion. Secretary of State James Burns argued against it. Burns was worried about domestic politics. An explicit guarantee for the emperor would look like a concession to the enemy. It would look soft. It would be politically difficult to sell to an American public that had been fighting Japan since Pearl Harbor. The guarantee was left out. The Potsdam Declaration went out without it. And in Tokyo, the Japanese government, reading the declaration carefully, looking for any signal about the emperor's fate and finding none, did what the peace faction had feared. The military took control of the public response. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, under pressure from the army, announced that Japan would mokusatsu the Potsdam Declaration. Mokusatsu is a Japanese word with multiple possible translations. It can mean to ignore. It can mean to treat with silent contempt. It can mean to withhold comment pending further consideration. The translation that reached Western news agencies and Washington was the harshest one. Japan had rejected the ultimatum. 5. The bomb. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb over the city of Hiroshima. The bomb detonated at 8:15 in the morning at an altitude of approximately 600 meters above the city center. The explosion killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness would reach an estimated 140,000. Hiroshima was not a purely military target. It was a city. It had military installations and was headquarters of the Second Army. But it also had 350,000 civilians. The choice of Hiroshima and the other cities on the target list had been made carefully. American planners had specifically preserved several Japanese cities from conventional bombing in the preceding months. They wanted cities that were intact, so the damage from the atomic bomb could be accurately assessed. Hiroshima had been largely untouched by the firebombing campaign. It was, in that sense, a controlled experiment. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, this one using plutonium, was dropped on Nagasaki. Between the two bombings, something else happened that is less remembered in Western accounts of the war's end. On August 8th, 2 days after Hiroshima, 1 day before Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Stalin had promised Roosevelt at Yalta that the USSR would enter the Pacific War within 3 months of Germany's defeat. Germany surrendered on May 8th. 3 months later was August 8th. Stalin kept his promise to the day. Soviet forces poured into Manchuria, destroying the Japanese Kwantung Army, 1 million men, Japan's largest remaining military force, within days. For the peace faction in Tokyo, the Soviet entry into the war was in some ways more shocking than the atomic bombs. Japan had been hoping to use Moscow as a mediator. That option was now gone. The last potential diplomatic channel had closed. On August 10th, the Japanese government sent a message through neutral channels to the Allied powers. Japan was prepared to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, with one condition: the imperial house must be preserved. 6. The condition that was always there. Washington's response to the Japanese offer was drafted by James Burns. It was careful, deliberately ambiguous. The Burns Note, as it became known, stated that from the moment of surrender, the authority of the Japanese government would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. It stated that the ultimate form of government of Japan shall be established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. It did not explicitly guarantee the emperor's position, but it did not explicitly threaten it either. Tokyo debated the response for 2 days. The military faction wanted to fight on. The peace faction argued that the Burns Note was, in effect, a guarantee that a government established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people would choose to keep the emperor. On August 14th, Hirohito intervened again, directly, personally, in a way that was almost without precedent in modern Japanese history. He recorded a message to the Japanese people announcing the surrender. The recording was smuggled out of the imperial palace overnight to prevent military hardliners from destroying it. It was broadcast on August 15th. The war ended, and the emperor remained. Not as a sovereign, not as a divine ruler, but as a symbol, a constitutional monarch, a figure around whom Japanese society could reorganize itself in defeat. Exactly what Japan's peace faction had been asking for since June. 7. The question that doesn't go away. The surrender terms that Japan accepted in September 1945 preserved the imperial institution. Hirohito was not tried. He was not charged. He was not removed. MacArthur made this decision deliberately, and he made it quickly. He concluded, correctly, as events would show, that using the emperor was the most efficient way to manage the occupation. Hirohito told the Japanese people to cooperate with the Americans. They cooperated. But this raises a question that historians have been arguing about since the documents were declassified. If preserving the emperor was always going to be the outcome, If it was the condition Japan was asking for in July, and the condition America ultimately accepted in August, why did it take 2 atomic bombs and a Soviet declaration of war to get there? Was there a moment in July 1945 when a different decision at Potsdam could have ended the war without Hiroshima? The historians are divided, genuinely, seriously divided. This is not a fringe debate. The traditional argument, the argument that justified the bombs at the time and still dominates popular understanding, is that Japan's military leadership would never have accepted surrender regardless of what the diplomats were signaling. The army controlled the decision-making apparatus. The army was prepared to fight to the last civilian. Without the shock of the atomic bomb, the argument goes, the peace faction could never have overcome the military's resistance. There is evidence for this. The army did attempt a coup on the night of August 14th to 15th to prevent the surrender broadcast from going out. Even after 2 atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war, there were officers who wanted to keep fighting. The revisionist argument, associated most prominently with historian Gar Alperovitz, whose 1965 book Atomic Diplomacy reopened the debate, is that the bombs were not primarily about Japan at all. They were about the Soviet Union. By August 1945, American policymakers were already thinking about the post-war world, and in that world, the Soviet Union was going to be the primary challenge. Demonstrating the atomic bomb, using it in combat, visibly, sent a message to Moscow that no diplomatic communiqué could send. Alperovitz's argument remains contested, but the documents he worked from are real. A third position, advanced by historians like Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, focuses on the Soviet entry into the war as the decisive factor, not the bombs. In this reading, what finally broke the deadlock in Tokyo was not Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but the destruction of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. Japan had been hoping, however desperately, that Moscow might mediate. When the Soviets declared war instead, that hope died. And without it, the peace faction finally had the argument it needed to overcome the military. None of these positions is simple. None of them fully accounts for all the evidence. What they share is this: they all depend on documents that were classified for decades after the war ended. Documents that were not available to the journalists, politicians, and historians who shaped the initial public understanding of why the bombs were dropped and whether they were necessary. The story the public received in August and September 1945 was the story the American government chose to tell. 8. What the documents show. The magic intercepts were not declassified until the 1970s. For 30 years after the war, the American public did not know that their government had been reading Japanese diplomatic traffic throughout the summer of 1945. Did not know that Washington had watched in real time as Japan's foreign minister instructed his ambassador in Moscow to seek peace negotiations. Did not know that the specific condition Japan was asking for, preservation of the emperor, was the same condition Japan ultimately received. When the intercepts became available, they did not settle the debate, but they changed it. They made it impossible to argue that American policymakers were simply unaware of Japanese peace feelers in July 1945. The feelers were there. Washington saw them. Decisions were made in full knowledge of them. Secretary of War Stimson's diary, also now available to historians, shows that he raised the emperor question directly with Truman. He argued for including a guarantee in the Potsdam Declaration. He was overruled. The reasons Burns gave for leaving out the guarantee were political, domestic politics, the optics of appearing to make concessions to the enemy. Whether different politics in July 1945 could have produced a different outcome in August, that is the question the documents raise and cannot answer. What they can answer is simpler, and in its own way more unsettling. Washington knew. Washington chose. And for 30 years, the documents that showed what Washington knew were locked away. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender. Emperor Hirohito was not present. He remained in the imperial palace. He would remain emperor until his death in 1989, 44 years after the war he had authorized, the war that killed somewhere between 15 and 20 million people across Asia and the Pacific. The magic intercepts sit in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. They have been there since they were declassified, 50 years after the events they document. The debate about what they mean, about whether Hiroshima was inevitable, whether it was necessary, whether a different decision in July 1945 could have changed what happened in August, that debate is still running. It will probably keep running. Because the documents don't give you an answer. They give you something harder than an answer. They give you the knowledge of what was known, and they leave the rest to you.